would like to introduce Willa Seidenberg. She's going to be speaking on the mid-century modern Spa-Tels of Desert Hot Springs. She explores the history of the town and the tools that can potentially help preserve its signature historic Spa-Tels. Let's give a really big hand to Willa.
Thank you, MJ. Appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. A little caveat before I start. My husband Bill, who's sitting over there, we live in Los Angeles, about 5 miles from the Pacific Palisades fire. We are not affected, fortunately, but we have many, many friends who lost their homes or are evacuated without power. So it's been, as you can imagine, a really tough week for all of us who live in Los Angeles, and I'm sure you guys are feeling it out here, even a couple hours away. But it's been a really rough week. So it's hard to see your city in such pain and to see people you know who are suffering. So, but it's nice that we get a little opportunity to talk about something that's a lot more fun than people losing their homes in fires. But so I'm here to talk about my research for my master's degree in heritage conservation. So let me just tell you a little bit about me. I am, well, I guess I should say I guess you never stop being a journalist, but I've been a journalist my entire life, public radio and television. I taught journalism at USC for 23 years, and in fact, one of my former students who works for County Supervisor Perez is here. I retired from USC in May of 2023, which has been, not that I didn't like teaching, I did, I love my job, but being retired is really wonderful, I loved it. My husband and I have been traveling a lot. And in the last couple of years before I retired, well actually about the last 5 years, I'd never gotten a master's degree because as a journalist of my generation, we didn't need them. And so I thought, I want to go back and be a student and delve into history, which is my second love besides journalism. So I got my master's in heritage conservation in 2023. So in the morning, I went to my last graduation as a faculty member, and in the afternoon, I got my degree as, literally, the same day I got my degree, my master's degree. Right now, as a retired person, I'm really busy. I'm producing 2 podcasts. That was my specialty, was audio journalism. And so one of the podcasts is called Save As, which I produced for the Department of Heritage Conservation at USC, the program I went through. A little bit in jeopardy now because our co-host, who is the director of the program, lost her home in the Palisades. And the home was built by her grandfather in the 20s, one of the first houses in the Palisades. Yeah, he worked for Will Rogers. So she is homeless, and obviously it's a really tough situation. The second one that I'm working on with Bill is called A Matter of Conscience, GI Resistance During the Vietnam War. And this is based on a project that we did 35 years ago, interviewing Vietnam vets who had done some kind of dissent or resistance when they were still in the military. Kind of a forgotten part of the history of the Vietnam War, which is always my interest, is bringing history to life. The Save As podcast also did a episode on my thesis, which is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So if you're interested in hearing it, you can go to saveas.place, and it's season 4, episode 7. So if you don't want to read the thesis, and who would want to read a thesis? I wouldn't want to. You can listen to the podcast. And actually, some of it was recorded during the open house of the Rock House a year ago. So it's kind of fun. So why did I choose Desert Hot Springs? I don't live in Desert Hot Springs. Why did I choose it to do my thesis? Bill and I started coming out to the desert when we first moved to LA. He thinks we came out here when he was in graduate school in the 80s. Of course, husband and wives always have different memories. I think it was when we moved out here in '92. We had a friend whose mother had a house out here, and she now has the house. And we used to go to Mahaya Lodge. Does anybody here remember that place? Yes, that's where we first started coming, and we absolutely loved the place. I mean, it was not the fanciest place in town, but it was comfortable, and especially after we had our son. It was, it was a place he could run around. We just loved the vibe. We really loved it. We loved going to the spas, and then we loved hiking. We loved going to Joshua Tree. And I had kind of known at that point that at one point this had been a place in the 50s where there were a lot of motels and people used to come here, but didn't know all that much about it. And over the years, we kept coming back to Desert Hot Springs because we really liked the, I think it was MJ that said, it's the old desert. I don't know if that was you, MJ, but it's, yeah, okay. We as opposed to Palm Springs, that was a lot more glitzy and fancy than when we were interested in. We liked the funkiness. We liked the gritty character of Desert Hot Springs. So this is part of the reason why we kept coming back here. And we would usually come at least once a year in the winter, but we came pretty regularly and always loved it. So when it was time to write a thesis, my advisor said, think about things that you love. Think about places you love. Think about what's important to you. And I don't know if we had been out here recently, but I thought, you know what? Desert Hot Springs is an important place to me. And I really thought I wanted to do something where I could dive into the history of a place. And so this was what I got, and I was so happy that I did it. And I will say, I made so many friends, including Jeff and Judy Bowman, we've become quite good friends with them now. They come and see us sometimes in LA. I cold emailed Jeff, and he emailed right back and said, yes, come out and stay in our studio. And from there, just introduced us to people, gave us a lot of great information, but MJ as well, and other people along the way who really shared a lot with us. Now, one of the things I wanted to say, and I said this to Dawn a little bit ago, but when you're doing a thesis, it's easy to go down rabbit holes, and rabbit holes are wonderful. And I'm going to tell you about two of the rabbit holes I went down in a little bit, but you always have your advisor there saying, okay, you got to get this done, you got to get this done, you got to finish, you got to graduate, so you can't go too far. And when I was doing it, I would start finding these really interesting rabbit holes, and I just want to keep going and going, and I had to stop myself. So this is all with the knowledge that there's so much more that can be done, and I know there are people in this room who have done that, who have gone down some of those rabbit holes that have uncovered a lot of history, and I just think it's fascinating. And if my thesis can add anything to that, I'm really excited about that. So, okay, so I know you guys probably all know the history of this town, but I thought on Judy's suggestion, I thought I'd just run through some highlights. So you know that the Cahuilla people inhabited the Coachella Valley many years ago. And people don't think they had a permanent settlement here, but clearly they came and enjoyed what we all love to enjoy here, which are the healing waters. So, and it's interesting because my husband and I have visited a lot of archaeological sites around the world. And in fall of 2023, we were in Sardinia, and we were discovering this culture that worshiped water because water is life. And it was very similar that a lot of places, a lot of indigenous cultures did not necessarily live where they celebrated and where they healed from things like spa water. So it makes sense that the indigenous people who lived here didn't put down down roots here. Sorry for the keep popping. But it was a sacred place for them, obviously. So people were passing through this area for quite a while, but of course the conditions here are so harsh that nobody really could set down roots until the homesteaders came about. And I know you heard from Randa last, was it last week? About early homesteaders. I pulled out Hilda Gray because she's a woman. And I think that it's pretty amazing that a woman set down roots. And in fact, in my, looking through the history of Desert Hot Springs, women were really important to the town's development. And I think that that's a very cool part of this town. So you know that it was the Homestead Act that opened up, homesteading, and that's why she was here. And then of course the Cabot Yerksha, Irene is back there, who runs the museum. And of course, when he came along, he's the one that really opened it up. I think it is interesting that he is the one that is credited with discovering the aquifers, yet he did get some of that information from an indigenous man. And that is one of the reasons why, it's clear that the Cahuilla passed through here, is because they did pass down knowledge. And so it came down through all these generations, in addition to some pottery shards and all that kind of thing. So of course, Cabot is, an incredibly important part of this town, as you guys all know. Important, as is LW Coffee. So I think, like, I don't know if I saw something that said this, or I just kind of made this up in my head, but, Cabot is really the father of this town, right? But LW Coffee is the founder, because he's the one that came in here and really got this going as a town. He obviously found out about it from Cabot, came here, and the minute he got here, he said, this is going to be a town devoted to health and wellness. Thank goodness. So he did a survey in around 1933, went about subdividing the town, working with other investors to sell plots of land. So, he was on his way to, achieving his vision. He was obviously controversial throughout his life, and I think he, I don't want to say something the wrong way, but I think he aggravated a lot of people. But he did have this vision, and when he opened his mineral baths, I know this is kind of lore in the town. 2,000 people showed up. They weren't expecting that, but they had a lot of fun at that opening, and people came. There was no place to stay. There were no Spa-Tels, no hotels, no Miracle Springs, no Kismet Hotel, nothing. So people were sleeping in their cars and out in the desert, because they really wanted that opportunity to soak in those baths. So in the 20 years that followed Coffee's, dozens of new spas opened in this general area near Coffee's. Because Coffee's was only a bathhouse, no lodging. And again, here's where another woman comes into play. Viola Dinsmore opened the Blue Haven Rancho Motel across the street from Coffee's. And she was the first one that combined the spas and the lodging. So there we go, women, again, pushing things forward, which I think is really great. The first one that was built up on Miracle Hill, where the hottest water is the Miracle Hill Spa Resort. And that was, that was opened in the early 60s. And then of course we know that there was I love the B-Bar H Guest Ranch, which started as a dude ranch, invitation only initially, and then opened up to the public in 1937. And I went through, I don't know how many issues of the Desert Sentinel microfilm at the library in Indio. And there was a column in the paper that was called Eavesdropping on the B-Bar H Hotel, which I thought was, they were, reporting on all the little comings and goings. And in fact, throughout the 50s and 60s, they often were reporting on who was in town, who was not in town, who was traveling, to another part of the country or overseas. And I thought that it captured such a great small town feel of, here are the people that live here, and here's what they're doing, and we're celebrating all of that. So, the residential part of the town grew up around the Spa-Tels, which kind of makes sense, but when things started, and now the figures before probably 1970 are, hard to say because Desert Hot Springs wasn't incorporated. So they weren't really counting Desert Hot Springs as its own little municipality until incorporated in the 60s, and so the first census would have been the 70s. But needless to say, the population kept going up and up and up. And also the other thing that I think is interesting and would be a great thing to be able to keep track of if there was any way to do it is the seasonal residents, the snowbirds who come and stay here. They're not counted in the census because it's your primary residence. So, you don't know how many people really in the height of the winter are really here. So that would be an interesting thing if there was a way to track some of that. Another woman opened the Idle Hour Cafe, Leonora Dodd, and this was a real hot spot in the town where everybody kind of hung out. She was known as Mom. And as you guys know, most of the small Spa-Tels that were built were vernacular, meaning that they weren't designed by architects. They were just kind of built by contractors, sort of very simple. They're all very simple. One of the exceptions is the Desert Hot Springs Hotel that was designed by John Lautner, who, do people know who John Lautner was? Yeah. Really well-known architect, disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright, some amazing buildings in LA and different places. So that's one of the few, and it's so, I love seeing, I didn't know about this, this hotel until I took an architecture class early in my, history of architecture class early in my studies, and the professor showed this picture, and I was like, I want to go there. Well, little did I know that that's not what it looks like now, that it's surrounded by a neighborhood, that it's been kind of fancified, which is fine, but so interesting to see that there was nothing there, and now it's, surrounded by neighborhoods. And in fact, this professor, some people had come to him when it was up for sale in, I don't know when it would have been, maybe the 80s, maybe the 90s, and they approached him and said, hey, do you want to go in on buying this? And he was like, no, too sketchy. Neighborhood's too sketchy. That was a deal he shouldn't have passed up, I guess. I am going to talk about another architect who is near and dear to someone in this room in a minute, but Lautner and actually MJ's father are, really two of the places that can be distinguished by architecture. So, the development of Desert Hot Springs coincided with a lot of things that were happening in the country after World War II. California's population exploded. People had more money to spend because during the war there was a lot of, the resources were scarce, people didn't have a lot of things to spend their money on. So people had money saved up. There was an increase in leisure time as the work week was getting shorter. So people had more time to go buy an automobile and tour around the country. So this created an increase in mobility. And that's when we really saw the rise of motels as opposed to hotels. Because in the past, people might take a train or, somehow get to a town or a city, and then they'd stay at a hotel. But once the automobile traffic started to increase and people were tooling around in their new cars, they needed places to stay. So that's where the motels started increasing. And that kind of went along with the development here in Desert Hot Springs. And the interstate was constructed under the Eisenhower administration. So we had I-10 coming from LA out here. So the people who had, it might have taken hours and hours to get out here before the interstate, now they could zip out here in a couple of hours. So that was really helpful. And then, in the 50s, people were interested in health and wellness as well. And so this was kind of a growing trend all over the world where people were looking for health and wellness travel, and this fit right in with that. So I think we could say that the heyday of Desert Hot Springs was the 50s through the 70s. I know that there are different estimates of how many places there actually were in town. I have in the back of my thesis, I tried to have a spreadsheet of every property that I could find. I know that I'm sure I missed some, but I tried to find as many. There were more than, I think there might have been 130 in that spreadsheet. So it's safe to say there were more than 100. Whether there were as many as 200, who knows? But most of them in the very early days were mom and pop places. Maybe 8 to 10 rooms with the spas and a swimming pool. Some properties were just apartments with kitchenettes because people would either come from LA or surrounding areas, or snowbirds would come, stay in these little apartments and buy day passes to the spas so that they could soak in the waters and swim in the pools. Obviously later, bigger hotels like this one were built. But in the early days, they were all these, very small, modest ones. And we do know that there were a lot of visitors from the East who came in the winter. People from Canada came, the Midwest. So, it was developing as a place where, and this is the other thing that I really have always appreciated about this town, is that it was really a town for middle and working class people to come and enjoy wellness travel, to soak in the spas. And you didn't have to have a lot of money, you didn't have to go to a big fancy resort, but you could have, access to these spas by coming here. And I'm sure that when I first started coming, that this was something that I intuitively kind of felt in my bones about this place. And I think it's one of the reasons why it attracted me. I'm not necessarily attracted to glitz. So one of my biggest rabbit holes was when I discovered the presence of a fairly significant Jewish population in the town. Many of them did own motels. A lot of times, I think people who bought the motels were people who maybe either had retired or had professional jobs and kind of just wanted to live a simpler life. And so they have these little spa motels that, they could have, 6 guests and they could just do all the cleanup, kind of like an Airbnb today. And so some of those hotel owners, Spa-Tel owners, were Jewish. And it makes sense because during the 20th century, a lot of Jews were migrating to Los Angeles, and particularly Jews from Eastern Europe. And many of them came because they were suffering from tuberculosis, either because they had gotten them in their home countries or because they had stopped in New York and they were working in factories. And one of the things that, I don't know, does anybody here know what City of Hope started out as? City of Hope was originally the Jewish Consumptive Relief Association. So it was formed to treat Jews coming into Los Angeles who had tuberculosis. So of course, those are people that would have been really interested. I mean, there were many, doctors and other kinds of health people who were saying these thermal waters can really help with arthritis and tuberculosis, anything that had polio victims, lots of things like that. So it makes sense that they would have migrated. And the other thing about it is that all cultures, almost, I think every culture that you could think of, they have bathing rituals. So in Eastern Europe, there are bathing. In Russia, there are the banyas, there are the onsen in Japan. Maybe Venezuela has some kind of, people have them. And so they, the Eastern European Jews that were coming had that also. And so I think they would have latched on to coming to Desert Hot Springs for that reason. In addition to the fact that they were pretty much locked out of Palm Springs. Palm Springs did not have covenants that said Jews can't own businesses, but that was the kind of idea that they enforced. And so the fact that and sometimes people, when I told people this, will say, yeah, but all those Hollywood stars, they had places. They didn't necessarily have them in Palm Springs. They might have had them in Palm Desert and Rancho Mirage, not Palm Springs, because in fact, and like Jack Benny, very famous Hollywood person, he couldn't join a club in Palm Springs. So, Palm Springs was not open to Jews, and so I'm sure they came here thinking, okay, this is a growing town, it's just getting started. They're welcoming to us, and I think that is another great thing about this town, is that it was welcoming to a lot of different people, a lot of different religions. You had the Baptists, the Catholics, the Presbyterians, and you had the Jews, which, in the 50s and 60s was not a given. A lot of places, didn't want Jews around, right? So the community had gone, this paper on the right, on the left, is from the B'nai B'rith Messenger, which is, B'nai B'rith is a Jewish newspaper in Los Angeles. And you can see all the ads for the motels. I even found I think it was Vancouver, Canada, there were ads in the Jewish newspaper in Vancouver for Desert Hot Springs, for Jews that wanted to come here for the winter. So they were, and it is interesting because in the course of doing this is kind of tangential, I discovered that there was actually almost earlier in the century, in the 20th century, almost like a Jewish green book in the East. And it was a the Green Book was where African Americans could stay when they were traveling, out of the South or anywhere, places that would welcome them. And this was a place that would, they served kosher food, so okay, it's okay to stay there. So there was this kind of pipeline of people that were looking for places that accepted them and welcomed them to stay. So the community was big enough that the Jewish community here wanted to build a temple. I think they estimated, I think I saw in the Sentinel, it was estimated to be about 75 in 1960. And which is, significant considering that the town wasn't very big at that point. So the temple was dedicated on November 2nd, 1958. This is one of my favorite photographs that I uncovered. This rabbi is Rabbi Isaac Block, and he was a sort of a circuit rabbi for the desert areas around Palm Springs. I think it was Southern California and Arizona. And I think at some point the Jews who were organizing here in Desert Hot Springs went to him and said, we need a rabbi, and can you work with us? So he quit the circuitry job and decided to work with the community here. And they raised the money and they built the temple, and this was the dedication. And there were lots of rabbis that came from all over the world, really, that brought their Torahs, and they were marching through downtown Desert Hot Springs, celebrating the opening of this The congressman for this area was there. They got congratulation telegrams from the governor. You know, so it was a big deal. The temple has not survived until now. The last rabbi was a guy who had converted. He was a Messianic rabbi who had converted from, I don't know if it was Catholicism or it was Protestant. Anyway, kind of a crazy guy, and the city eventually bought it in 2008. It was on Pearson. The city bought it for more than the value of the land. And they had plans, the city had plans to turn it into either a fire station, or I think maybe they were also thinking about a health clinic or something. But you know, it really fell into disrepair, as many properties did around those years, and it was demolished in 2010. That's what it looked like when it was still up, and this is what it looked like when they were demolishing it, when it had fallen into disrepair. So kind of sad. So now I want to highlight two properties that actually fit into the story of the Jews in town. The first one is Mahaya, which is the one that I had first gone to, and just still holds very dear to my heart. That property was built by Rose and Nathaniel Bertram. And Rose Bertram was a Jewish immigrant from Romania. She came to this country as, I think, a teenager. She and her husband had settled in Venice, California. And she was a fundraiser for City of Hope. And actually, she was a very good fundraiser for them. And they had, I don't know if they still do this, but they had a series of local chapters all over the place that would raise money for City of Hope. And she increased those chapters, that network of chapters, and a lot of them were run by women, volunteers. She increased those chapters from 33 to 300. So she really spoke to people, right? And interesting that after she moved here, she became a fundraiser for Angel View. So she brought her fundraising capabilities here. So they decided, she was suffering from arthritis. They decided to come out here and build a place. So I had always thought Mahaya was some kind of indigenous name. And I used to kind of joke, Bill can tell you, I was like, Mahaya, I wasn't sure how you actually said it. Well, in fact, what it means, it's a Yiddish word, and it means blessing or joy. And she named it that because that's what guests felt when they eased themselves into the spas, right? And they had 3 pools there. One was called the Pool of Everlasting Love, the Pool of Everlasting Wisdom, and the Pool of Joy and Laughter, which I think is just a beautiful, beautiful thought. So the other property is Hope Springs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It started out as La Bella Sari. It was built in 1963 by Lillian Rose and Nettie, I don't know if you pronounce her name Zaid, or does anybody know here? Might be Nettie Zaid. So they were introduced to Desert Hot Springs by Rose Bertram. And I think it's likely from all the things I read that these 2 women lived in Los Angeles, and I think it's likely that they probably met each other through B'nai B'rith circles. And so after Rose and her husband came out here, I think they must have come out to visit or something, or Rose told them about it, and they decided they were going to build a place too, not too far from Mahaya. And so one of the other people that I spoke extensively with was Christopher Tandon, who was a co-owner of Hope Springs with a few other people up until a couple years ago. And Christopher he now works in Hollywood, but he had some architectural training. And when they first bought Hope Springs, he thought, this place this place had to be designed by an architect because it has way too many architectural features to have been built by a contractor. So he did a lot of research. He talked to Lillian, or one of the women's family. He went to the Indio Library and he did research. I mean, he did a lot of research, and he finally had to conclude. And part of the reason why he thought this was this. This is a very has the split flue there and sunken fireplace. He finally concluded. Now, I don't see any evidence that I can't find anything that says this. So when I started researching it, I was really intrigued by this, and I started doing a lot of research, and so I discovered that both Mahaya and Hope Springs, or La Bella Sari, were built by Charles Elliott. Anybody ever heard of Charles Elliott? He was a general contractor. I suspect that he met Rose in Los Angeles because he and his wife Zelda moved from LA to Desert Hot Springs in the 50s. And he was also an immigrant from Romania. So I suspect that he knew the Bertrams in Los Angeles. And when they came out here, they hired him to design the Mahaya. And I thought, well, maybe he talked to an architect and got some ideas and then built, I thought maybe he built, Mahaya and Hope Springs based on some, information that he had gotten from an architect, but then he just did them. I didn't know. He's an interesting fellow too, and his wife actually was, I think, one of the first women contractors to be awarded a license. So, that another interesting little tidbit. But lo and behold, MJ and so I was doing all this research on the internet, and I kept coming up with this listing from UC Santa Barbara's library for archival materials related to an architect named John M. Alcott. And I saw they had the listing of the boxes, and I saw one that was a couple that were Desert Hot Springs. So I decided, well, I got to go up and look at these archives. And so MJ and I went up to Santa Barbara one day, and we started pulling out boxes and looking at drawings, and I found it. I found the drawings of Mahaya and La Bella Sari, and it was like, I can't even tell you, it was like this eureka moment. I called Christopher right away and said, you were right, it was designed by an architect. And I think if there's one thing that really needs more research, and I know MJ is working on this, is the contribution that her father made to the Coachella Valley, because he was part of a very storied USC architecture graduates from the 40s and 50s who went on, people who went to architecture school at USC in those years went on to do amazing things. And so he was clearly influenced by these amazing architects who we all know and have done really left their mark on Southern California. And so he was part of that whole gang. And he obviously did a really nice job in these two properties. And so that was a really fun, discovery. And and also I realized I wanted to say, going back to the Jewish community, is I talked to a woman I know who I used to work with, who grew up in West Los Angeles, went to Temple in West Los Angeles, Mogan David Temple. And she told me that at her temple, everybody went to Desert Hot Springs on the weekends, mostly because their grandparents came here. And she said, we'd be in Hebrew school on a Thursday, and are you going to Desert Hot Springs? Of course, she couldn't remember much about it, but I was like, what was the place like these days? She couldn't remember. But what she did remember is they all came here because this is where their grandparents were. So they would come, and she described it as the Catskills for West Side Jews. So if you need a new slogan for Desert Hot Springs,
Nice.
yeah, right. So I think it is really telling that that Jewish community was able to. And Emery, who works here, I don't think he's in here, but he talked about when he would come and visit his, I think it was aunt and uncle. He said there was everybody was here: Hungarians, Germans, all sorts of people. Maybe not people of color, but but still, open to different kinds of people in an era when that wasn't always true. So obviously we all know that Desert Hot Springs went through a terrible period of decline. And I had a former student, and after she graduated, this was probably in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, her first job was in Palm Springs. And I remember I saw her once and I said, oh, I love going to Desert Hot Springs, that's one of my favorite places. And she kind of looked at me like, really? And she said, the only reason I go there is to cover gang shootings. And I was like, okay, I understand. But even during that period, we were still coming out here and we really liked it. So, that's when we first started coming out. So yes, it was, unfortunately, a lot of those old motels got turned into apartments, got turned into substance rehab units, or some of them were demolished, or some of them just kind of limped along and stayed. But in early 2000, Desert Hot Springs had the highest crime rate in the Coachella Valley of all 8 cities, and today it has the best. So one of the best. So that is really a testament to all of you and to this town. And one of the places that led this renaissance was the Miracle Manor, which was one of the first ones up on Miracle Hill. And when I was pregnant, I think, Jeff, you called this baby moon, we came out here for a baby moon, and we stayed at Miracle Manor. And I remember at the time, I think he had only owned it for about a year at that point. And we remembered hearing that, some LA architect had bought it and fixed it up. And it was, it was nice, no TVs and nice fluffy robes. And that picture in the middle is me in the pool at Miracle Manor.
Nice.
Pregnant, I forget, I don't know, maybe about 7 months pregnant. And so he and his partner, April Bryman, found the place, decided to fix it up, and, reincarnated it as a boutique spa. And that kind of touched off that renaissance. And so other properties came along, and, can you still hear me? And, so many others soon followed. And, yes, it might not be quite as much the working middle class clientele, although, for people like us, who aren't going to spend, $500 a night at a resort, this was a place even then where we could, we had to stop going to some of the places because they stopped allowing children, and so then that was kind of out for us, but that did definitely start the renaissance, and people started, and and again, the property prices were low, so people started moving here. Population goes up, so it kind of came out of it, and I think it's a really wonderful story that the city was able to revive itself from that. So because this was a thesis about heritage conservation, I had to make recommendations about how the city could preserve its past. That's what we do in heritage conservation. And I'm not gonna go through all of them, and I will tell you the policy is not my strong suit. But one of the things that I really would love it if the city undertook was to do a historic research survey. And what this is a city, a town, does a systematic way of looking at all the properties that are historic in their town and documenting the condition they're in, where they are, when they, you know, all the details about them. And then once you have that, you have a way to make planning decisions, because you know what's historic, you know where things are, and who knows, you know, the Rock House now is open, and it's great that it's a historic landmark for Riverside County, and Cabot's the only one on the National Register, but who knows, you know, we don't know what other things are lurking about here. And, you know, places like the Desert Hot Springs resort next door, I mean, the threshold for national and state is 50 years, so anything older than 50 years can be considered historic. But until you know what you have, it's hard to make any decisions about what you're gonna do with those properties. So it really is useful in planning. And the other thing that it's great for is community engagement. LA did, I don't know if anyone here has heard of Survey LA, but that was a huge, big project. And they had volunteers, they had an app, they had volunteers going out and surveying, basically, all the properties that were thought to be historic in Los Angeles. And you can go on the website and you can see information about them. They had a systematic way of questions that people had to answer, and it really helped highlight the historic resources that the city does have. And even a town like Desert Hot Springs, which is not as big as LA, can benefit from doing this. And you know, as I said in my thesis, I tried to list as many as I could, what year they were built, what their original names were, that kind of thing. So that's a good starting point. And people in this room have a lot of knowledge about the properties as well. The other thing that I think that the city would benefit from is a historic preservation ordinance. There's a lot of misinformation about what being a historic property means. People think, oh, you can't make any changes, you can't do this, you can't do that. Not necessarily true. You know, national, as I'm sure, Irene, I don't think you were there when they did the nomination, but those are pretty involved. And even, I guess Marge wrote the one for Riverside County. I mean, they can take some time, and they're very involving. But the local ordinances are the best because they're the ones that are the strongest. They can provide the best protections. And the good thing about the local ordinances is that a city can write the ordinance however they want. So, you know, if you don't want, you know, what XYZ has, you don't have to have that. You can do it the way you want to do it. So you can tailor it to fit your needs and what works best for your community. So I think that a historic ordinance would really help the city in being able to protect some of these Spa-Tels because, and I'm sure you guys all know that the Spa-Tel came from, you know, spa motel. And nobody calls them that anymore, but now since I did my thesis, I love calling them that because I think it's a great name. But, you know, Desert Hot Springs, if you take those away, you really change the character of this place. And, you know, now there's a lot of bigger places, like there's Azure Palms and there's this place, you know, there's a lot of bigger hotels. But it was those small ones that really marked the city. And I think that really attract people to come here. And the best thing that some of these historic ordinances, local ordinances can do is really protect from properties from demolition. And you can put in there things that, you know, require owners to meet certain criteria, so that they don't let them fall into disrepair. It was really painful, as I'm sure it was for all of you, to see that Sahara lot demolished. And I mean, when Bill and I had actually gone in there one day and just photographed. We were photographing all over. It was just disrepair. And then to come one day and see it all gone was really, really sad. And so I hope that we don't see that again in any other of the properties. And that was a lot of properties at once that got demolished. So, you know, you don't want too much of that happening, or it really changes the character of your town. And so some of these ordinances can help to prevent that. And you know, the other thing about it is that heritage tourism has become a very big moneymaker for places. And in fact, in some cases it's worked so well that some communities are like, no more. Bill and I were in Dubrovnik, Croatia, about 6 years ago, and it's just like it's overrun with cruise ships. There's too many people, you know, walking on these ancient walls. I don't think that's going to happen here, but you know, it is a draw for people. People want to hear the stories of the past, and you know, I think Desert Hot Springs should be leaning into its history a little bit more. I mean, you know, the story. I mean, there's a colorful history in this town, and you guys have all documented it in different ways. You know, the Rock House. That's a great story. Hilda Gray, that's a great story. I mean, there's really good stories that people have of coming here and of living in this town. And people are interested to know what's happening. So for instance, you know, if you go to Hope Springs to stay for the night, it would be interesting to see who built this place. You know, how did it come about? Who was the architect that built it? There's nothing like that. There's not even a plaque that commemorates where Coffee's bathhouse was. And so, you know, I put this picture in. This is a commemorative structure that's in the Sugar Hill neighborhood in Los Angeles. And you can have things like that that kind of tell a story of what happened here or what was going on here. We had this Jewish community that built a temple. It's now gone, but here's a plaque that, you know, tells what it's about. And I think that it would help the city to capitalize on some of that, you know, especially younger people. They're interested in this kind of thing. Of course, they're interested in the spas and the massages and all of that. But I think that it would be a draw for people, and you know, to maybe have some brochures that tell some of the colorful stories, that tell the town's history, that really, you know, give an idea of this place is not just some, you know, place that was plopped down in the desert where, you know, you can buy cheap pot or whatever. I don't know what other people think about here, but anyway, those are the kinds of things that really could be the beginning. And sometimes also some of these ordinances that and some of the tools that preservationists have to protect their cities can help with tax breaks. And so they can sometimes help the owners, because I know, having talked to several motel owners, that it's not an easy, unless you have a big place and you can scale up, it's not easy to make a go of it when you have only a few rooms and you can't scale up. And you know, a lot of people don't want to come here in the summer, although some people do. But you know, it's a hard business, right? And so helping the owners preserve their properties and only helps the town as well. So that's it.